Welcome to the Understanding Projects podcast. This is Dave Barrett. My discussion today is with Derek Hemington. I've come to know Derek over the past year, as he has a similar role at another college. That is, he's the program coordinator of Fanshawe College's project management program, while I'm at Conestoga College. During our discussion, Derek described his experience as an external consultant, working with organizations to define the scope of the project. During this process, it is necessary to define which organization will develop each deliverable. That is, will the deliverable be within the scope of the consultant's project, or will it be within the scope of the customer's project? Derek describes a number of strategies that he has used to ensure that this is effectively managed. And while the focus of the discussion was on projects where an external consulting organization was involved, the process discussed could also be applied to internal projects. Here is my discussion with Derek Hemington. Thanks for coming on. And when we were first setting up this discussion, the title that you suggested, or the theme, was the elusive pursuit of the real scope when working jointly with customers. And that's either internal or external customers. So interesting topic, and I think one that's really relevant. So just to start, so what do you mean by this, and what's sort of the what's the need, or what's the problem behind this that we're trying to solve when you came up with that title?
Well, I find it's been frequently a challenge when you're working with, as you said, an internal or external customer, where the work is shared. What doesn't matter the split, in determining who's going to take what scope. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. If it's external, maybe the customer is trying to minimize costs from, say, a consulting company or the supplier. Internally, it might be maybe a little bit about control. Maybe they don't want their IT department to know certain things about what they're doing. But there's this little game that goes on where you're trying to find exactly what has to be done and who's going to be doing it. And it is a game. It goes back and forth, and it's iterative. And sometimes it works out really well, and sometimes you have to adapt the game to have success.
Yeah. So let me just like sort of speak that back to you. Oftentimes when we're learning about projects and project management and managers, we're reading, about it in books and in courses. The assumption always seems to be there is a project manager, and representing a team that's going to create something. And then there is a customer or client who is going to receive everything. And the roles are completely sort of separate, provider,
Mm-hmm.
and purchaser or receiver. And so what you're describing is a hybrid of that, right? That the customer, in that case, the person receiving it, there's some of the scope of the project that they're going to do themselves. Like they're going to do some of it, and that's the part that is the game, or is the challenge that you're describing, is that what is on each side of the line, like who's doing, what is project A doing, like
Mm-hmm.
and what is the customer project B doing, and the management of the scope between those two. So is that's sort of the challenge that you're describing?
Yes, that's that shared thing. And as I mentioned, sometimes it could be cost, but other times it's, in the case of an external consultant working for a client, the external client sometimes can't do certain things. Like I used to work for a company. We did a lot of data integrations, getting an SAP or an Oracle, financial or inventory management system to talk to another app, right? And they different languages, a little bit different. But part of all this integration was sometimes data migration, and before that was data cleansing. So we don't know their data well enough to go in there and cleanse the data and validate it and look for errors. And The client had to do that, right? So we're kind of forced into that, and the client will just might say, yeah, we'll do that, but they haven't really, because it doesn't involve a cost in a quote. They haven't really thought it through about how long is that going to take, who's going to do it. If they're running out of time, do they want to call us in for an emergency? Do they want us for some technical support? And so that line, as you said, is the battle, and it can, it's like a football game. The line can move back and forth depending on the circumstances.
Right. So that's where you're saying it originates, is that, and let's use the example of an external consultant. Say it's an outside company. And it's an outside organization that's providing some service, some project that's going to create something for the buying organization. And so there's going to be a tendency, because there's budgets are always limited and so on. They might have, say, $100,000 or something to spend, and as they start creeping close to that amount, that's the thing that's going to start to motivate them to say, well, okay, move that out of your scope. Hey,
Right.
consultant, you don't have to do that. We'll do it ourselves. Now, and that's where I think you're saying they may not have a solid plan as to how. Like, it's easy to say, like, okay, we'll just use our own
Right.
resources and it's kind of free, as like they're here anyways. But that's
Yeah.
the thing that starts the tendency to do that starts to create potential issues for the end result. Because and so what happens after that? Like, what have you seen happen where the customer is stating, yeah, we'll do that, and then is it that partway through the project they start to identify, well, we can't do that, so consultant, will you come and save the day on that?
Well, a couple things, multiple things happen. One of the things could be, we'll have done something many times. It's just that it doesn't look like we're a good fit to do it right now. But we do know, the process behind that. So we'll ask the customer, okay, so if you're going to do it, will you be doing, X? Will you be doing these 5 steps? And then you get into discussion about, well, what do you mean 5 steps? We have 3 steps. And then you realize, okay, so that means you won't be doing this and you won't be doing that, right? And that's when it's like, so who's doing that? In other words, what they feel the scope is could be different, their part scope of the project, just one piece could be different than what the consultant thinks it is. And so you have to find those gaps and determine who's going to do them. Um, Even in the part that is in scope, quite often we have discussions where you're trying to get answers out of the client. They're worried about budget, which is why they're doing perhaps part of the project, and the answers start to get short. And they're not full, they're not complete, and you're trying to pull, maybe the some of the people you're interviewing are for requirements are reluctant, and so you're working them, trying to get the real scoop of what could be the problems of doing the scope and what is the real scope. And the perfect example of that, and this is, I call it, using the negative approach. They'll say, okay, this is what we want, and you've prepared in advance, this really helps. And then you say, okay, so that means you don't want this. And then immediately say, oh, no, we want that. Okay, so you want that and that, but that means, from what you said, you don't want this, right? So you start building these things, and sometimes you're bumping into the scope that they said they were going to do with these questions, and you start to have a whole conversation that's a little more realistic on who's doing what when.
Right. So it sounds like you are really needing to get pretty specific on scope. Yeah, like and you're saying that one of the methods is by saying, okay, then you're in effect not wanting this. Like, that's, you're saying you don't want this, and that's where you're saying, oh, wait, whoa, I don't. But the net result is that you are very much defining what's in and what's out of you're trying to get very particular on that. That's true?
Absolutely, that I use the word negative. We're not trying to be negative.
Yeah.
They're just, someone will tell you, I need a car. Oh, okay. So, what's the smallest car that's made today? Right? A smart car.
Smart
No, no,
car.
no, I need a bigger car, right? What do you mean big car? Right. And so then you mention, oh, Jaguar, it's only $80,000. Like, no, no, I don't need that. So it's simple things like that, obviously in a more sophisticated context. But when they do say it's clarified and they say they're going to do it, a $1 million question sometimes, well, exactly who on your side, if you don't mind me asking, is going to do that? And it could be the IT department, for example. And said, I thought your IT department was way overloaded. Like, how are you going to secure some resources to get that piece done in a predictable time fashion? Because this is a time sensitive project, right? So then you have now that's a little bit tricky because they may just say, leave it up to us, we'll do it. But depending on your relationship, you may be able to have a conversation there, and they may come to the realization that this is going to be risky, relying on some of their internal resources because they're super busy.
Yeah. So it seems to me there's a fair amount of risk involved here, right? Because you're trying to, in that case, like there's a curtain that's in front of their organization, whether it's internal or external. You don't have full visibility on their resources and their interrelationships with IT or the marketing department or whoever it is or even their own priorities. Like it may even be people that are within the manager's, direct control, but there might be other priorities. So there's a veil or a curtain that you can't see through, and you're basically having to ask the question, are you able to provide this? And they're going to say yes or no, or maybe. And so it seems to me that there's a big risk here because, your project, you want to succeed. Like you're not a consultant who wants a failed project,
Mhm.
and having that thing at the end where you say, well, we did our part, but it's that guy's problem, especially when you're pointing at your customer, I don't think that's a happy place to be. So what have you done or could be done to mitigate that risk? Like, is it, have a bunch of contingency resources in case they come at the last minute, or, is it, what we said before, just, really getting contractual level requirements in place? Like how do you mitigate or I guess safeguard yourself against, the splatter coming back at the end if this thing falls apart and it's because of their lack of resources or capabilities that it splatters back on you?
That's a really good question. So a lot of the contracts, I was working on with this one company, they were in the range of two, three, four, $500,000. So they weren't, multi-million dollar projects. But just and a lot of it was a statement of work, and we would sign on it. Both parties would sign, so it wasn't really that rigid a contract. But putting in a segment on, and you could call it exclusions or customer responsibilities, or yeah, maybe not out of scope. It's kind of like trying to absolve yourself from something, but something. And in that, you're highlighting what the scope or the requirements are that the customer is going to do, and just a few friendly notes on, some challenges around it, maybe a couple sentences, maybe the expectations that, the hope is that IT will be available to do this in a reasonable amount of time, heavy workload. So it's almost like a very neutral story. Um, but when something comes up, something bubbles up, usually around 3/4 of the way through the project, things start to escalate on price, people get tense, and they thought, I thought you were doing that. That's when you kind of just drift casually over and say, well, let's just look on the exclusion list or the customer, responsibility side. And you go down there and there's just this little friendly story on how they hope to do it and how they plan to do it. And there could be some issues. And then everyone kind of calms down and goes, oh, right, yeah, we did help craft that or write that or agree to that. And then it becomes So what do you want to do? We can help you. It might mean more money, it might not. Maybe there's something else they can do in lieu of. But you're trying to keep it friendly and work towards the goal. Um, and it's a dance. Like most
Yeah,
client engagements, it's a dance.
right, right. And it's almost that, you know, if you've done this long enough, you'll realize that this often happens.
Oh
the
yeah.
the world is a bit of a messy place when it comes to these sort of things, and that, two things come to mind. Is one is, again, the ongoing value of knowledge of your, customer, in this case your stakeholder, but in this case customer and their organization, and gaining their trust and knowledge of what's happening on their side, probably allows you to have that sort of early warning system in place where you can kind of see the signs coming, which would allow you to react. And the other thing is just, it's probably a thing to going into a project like this, just knowing that, well, there's probably a 25% or X% probability that you might need to increase your effort. You might need to apply additional resources. And do you have access to those resources? Like, what's happening on your side if the other side can't carry the full weight? Do you have excess? So it seems to me that that would be something that a consultant would be wanting to do. That would be a good consultant would do that.
Yeah, we used to we had this great question, and we could use it at the project level, or different pieces of work where we're debating on who's going to do what. So at the project level, maybe it did look like 50% work. The big question was, so do you, Mr. Customer, Mrs. Customer, Ms. Customer, want to be responsible for this project and we're helping? Or do you want us to be responsible and you're helping? Now you can go down that into part 3 of 5. You ask the same
Right.
question. So for this piece, do you want to be responsible and we'll help, or vice versa? And quite often, like in these friendly discussions with well-established relationships, there'd be like a 20-second pause where the customer is really thinking about this and they're reflecting back to other projects. They're looking how busy IT is, and then they would kind of say, no, this, we want you to be responsible and we'll help. And then we're starting to define roles on, who do we need from them to help. We can define what's their availability. We need commitments on that availability. Part of all this is also when we're breaking up these pieces, the pieces that the customer is doing specifically, we're trying to, in that exclusion list, for lack of a better word, we're also trying to flag the ones that are sort of, well, I guess you could say they're on the critical path. They're the most important ones that'll delay the project, particularly if it's time sensitive. And we want to make a note there, that something about, the estimate for this piece of work, customer's going to do it. Here's who in the customer organization will do it. It's 1 week to 2 weeks, because that's the best they can estimate. But by capturing that in that list, we kind of aggregate it and say, now you realize we have this huge range in the project. We're part of the range, the
Right.
consulting organization, but actually your range is actually bigger on the date that we're going to finish. And that acknowledgement really helps, because without it, when things become late, the customer always expects the consultant will somehow make up the time.
Yes.
And sometimes we can, and we do want to, but sometimes we can't, because the next piece is, really predicated on the customer's resources, and we don't have a lot of influence in, controlling their resources that they're having a hard time deploying anyways internally. So that's kind of another subtlety that we found worked.
Yeah, no, I can see that for sure. I really like your um who's responsible and who's helping, and having those really honest discussions about that, um like way before you ever get to the work, to do that. It almost reminds me of, one of the tools that we teach is RACI charts, responsibility assignment matrices, and so on. And in RACI terminology, it would be who's accountable, and
Hmm.
who's and who is responsible. Like the accountable person will make sure it gets done, and the responsible is who's doing the work. And so it's just different methodologies. But I like the approach you said really is almost a little more understandable, like that who helps. Yes, I'll be working on it.
Yeah,
um
I'm
but
taking
I
taking
yeah,
liberties with the racy format, right? I'm kind of not really different. A lot of customers, clients may not really use a racy, so to
no,
them, there's responsible and helpers, and that's it.
yeah,
So,
yeah,
and that's it's a very simple, direct question,
yeah.
and
No, it's not anything specific about racy. There's lots of different there's lots of different ways to express it with different codes for different risk involvements and so on. I think it's just good having that discussion. Like that's another example of saying, you're going into there's these uncharted waters that we're
Mhm.
in, which is, we have two organizations that are working together for an outcome, and trying to figure out where where the lines are between them, and we're trying to document it as much as we can. But there's just things that happen. And so, whether you call it accountable or whether you call it responsible, as long as you know what the words mean. But I do like, even though it's not racy, but the term, who's responsible for making sure it gets done and who's helping them is, I think, a really key thing. And if that leads to further discussion, that's a good thing. Like if that's something that, way early in the project, you can sit down and say, well, what is the answer to that? Now, if the answer comes back, well, we're both responsible. Well, that's something to dig into further.
Mhm.
I've often said, well, if everybody's responsible, no one is. So
Right.
so you got to be, and I know that is debatable. I mean, you could have scenarios where, no, I'm clearly doing these things and you're clearly doing those things, and that makes sense. But there's always this middle ground, this interface between the two, that question becomes, as well, if that starts to fall apart, what happens then? Who's going to pick it up? And having that type of discussion is key, I think, or as early as you can in the project.
Yeah, I like when you said, we try to avoid those, and I definitely try to. Sometimes, and again, it depends on availability of resources and the relationship, but to try to get away from that, well, we both are, it's like, okay, well, let's pick, even if we flipped a coin, let's pick two options. You're responsible, and in order for you to feel comfortable with that, maybe we could provide one of our more senior people to assist and advise because they have done this 12 times before, and vice versa. Now, if we're responsible, in order to really understand your organization and make us feel like we, can take on that responsibility, we'd be looking for a half day for 2 weeks of this person, who's a real key person in your organization, but we need them. So again, this is all about scope, right? We're trying to go back and forth, but it's a great discussion to have on the joint responsibility, because then now you start bringing in more details. And another element of that is, I mentioned it already, is time.
Right.
Some of these things, if you're responsible, you can have a conversation where they will say, um, yeah, we'll need between 2 to 4 weeks, which is a huge range for a specific activity, and so the conversation might switch on, given the timeline, can you live with that? Can you live with yourself being responsible for that? Because I understand you can't dictate certain resources. Um, and so that's a great conversation to have, because the timeline frequently will bounce scope from one side to the other. Just the
Right.
variability, you can think of it as the risk and the duration of the overall project or pieces of the project. Um, so Yeah, it's not as straightforward as running around getting the requirements and then off you go and you're on your own, and those are the easier projects.
Yeah, there is that. Again, that's what I was alluding to at the very start of our discussion, is there is this linear, it's almost a mythical linear project that
Mhm.
you go get the requirements, you develop the scope, you develop the deliverables, and you implement, and it's all this sort of linear process. And in the real world, it's much more iterative or circular than that. And you know, I'm I'm trying to imagine. So I'm just thinking through in my mind of, okay, your customer, you know, there's a certain part of the scope that they're responsible for. You agreed to it before, and et cetera, et cetera, review appropriate documentation, and you worked it out in your schedule that it was going to be 2 weeks. That
Mhm.
and they agreed to it. 2 months ago they said, yep, 2 weeks is good, plenty of time. Uh, the project progresses and they come back to you and say, it's going to be five. We can't get it done. IT's busy or whatever, or somebody's
Right.
on holidays that we didn't know that they were going to be sick or on holidays. So it's going to be 5 weeks. And you will then go, oh, well, we had a task. We were depending on that. And
Yeah.
we even left a little gap of 2.5 weeks. We left a little contingency in our schedule. We said we're okay if it's 2.5 weeks, but what are we going to do now? That's 5 weeks. And so it seems to me that would happen. That's probably not an uncommon occurrence. And so it really, you know, leads to me the importance of, first of all, being able to know what the impact is. Like, you're going to be, I'm sure, back in your office, when you get that news, the first thing you're going to do is go, oh boy,
Yeah.
oh, we're going to have to work this one through. But having, a decent handle on your own critical path and your own resources and so on, we'll be able to determine, well, can we work with that? What can we do to shift things around? If it is 5 weeks, what does that mean? That to me is the value of having good data on your side. You know, um,
In that discussion of the customer doing a piece of work, there's the discussion on the actual scope, the resources or the skills or the knowledge to do that scope. And then there was the impact on the schedule, which might swing it from the customer over to the consultant. But another part of that is the impact piece you mentioned. So one of the things, by trying to identify at a fairly granular level the elements of the scope that the client is doing, or your exclusion list, you can put a lot of columns in there. It can just be two, depending, but it could be like five. And one of them is the impact on the, maybe a critical path type problem. But the other one is, if this is delayed, the follow-on pieces are done by resources that from the consulting firm are booked 4 weeks in advance. So if that misses, we're telling you now, we only have one available in Canada who knows, certain mainframe software. We can fly someone in from the US at about twice the price when you add up travel and currency, and you identify that, right? And that's another point where they may say, no, we still want to do this, but you've got it in your exclusion list as it's a risk, right? And if it doesn't come back to you in terms of you take it over, that's fine. But then no one's surprised when you're saying, okay, well, now not only is it 2 weeks late, then we're going to have a 2 week gap before we can bring that person as per our document that we jointly worked on. The more you can get the client to work on this exclusion list with you, the better.
right, right. It seems to me it's a combination. We're almost describing a combination of you know, it's probably true of a lot of things in projects. Of there is an element of preventative nature. If you can come up with lists, if you can figure out who's responsible, if you can put all your cards on the table initially and build a full plan, it starts to minimize this from happening. But then the other half is, it's just going to happen. Like, this is, the messiness of the real world, the changing priorities, the emergencies that come up means this is going to happen. You just have to be good at this. You just have to be able to react. And then, like you say, well, yeah, there's a resource in the US. It will cost X amount to happen. He or she can be here by this date, and here's the impact. And
Yeah.
do we want to do this or not? So this constant kind of reshuffling of the constraints to say, well, okay, now this will cost us an extra $10,000. It'll delay us by this amount of time, but do we want to do it? Like that to me is being able to have that conversation is key.
Yeah, this example I used was integration, usually from package systems over to custom systems. But another organization I worked with, we did custom Salesforce implementations, including coding, and we used Agile. And so this relationship with the client was a lot easier on, 2-week sprints typically, where the scope for that 2 weeks, right, or a sprint backlog had certain things, and then we could switch it. The customer was very engaged with us. They're looking for the next demo.
Right.
And it's a whole different, it's a different attitude. And I wish we could do that with everything, but a lot of things, a lot of projects just, we can't really fit them into that model. So part of what we're talking about today is kind of doing the best we can, given we don't have that tight working relationship with, say, end users like we might have in an agile project.
So why do you think that's interesting? Why do you think that is? Like that's, if that could solve it, why wouldn't, every project we say, hey, why don't we work this way? What's stopping? What do you feel is stopping some projects from going that way?
That's the big picture agile question, right? Customers who say, I want a fixed price, or a fixed price not to exceed, or I want to, I want to know it's between, X and Y dollars in a fairly small bracket, and define the scope, and then we can get financial approval. And in agile, it's a little bit of different approach, as we're trying to create the most value we can, which may not be a tightly defined scope.
Right.
Depends on what we find out. We find something more valuable and the product owner wants to implement that, then that's the direction we're going to go in the next sprint, right? So,
right.
Yeah, I thought of it could be financial control, budgeting, and an integration. That's perhaps not the best candidate. Although I'm not saying it wouldn't work, but it's, there may not be a huge upside in the value of that integration. It's more like we just have to do this because doing it manually with spreadsheets, we're making too many errors and it's costing us money.
Right. And so, so I mean, really what you're saying, there are just certain types of situations where there is a need for a certain functionality to be completed by a certain date, which leads us more to traditional, if it was if you're a consultant coming in and helping an organization, update their financial systems to be ready for, say, 2022 tax regulations. They're that's a hard deadline that you need to meet, and need to have certain functionality by that time, which would perhaps reduce the potential to iterate through a number of sprints and sort of see where you get at sort of a certain point in time.
If you kind of blend the two, trying to, and this is more of I think it's more of an IT thing. When you're entering some of these projects where not only is there a big discussion over who's doing what between the customer and the consultant, let's say, or a consulting firm, the overall scope is still maybe a bit of a question mark.
Mm-hmm.
So trying to introduce early that we will probably find more scope, even in an integration, less so an integration, but still we would find things that in order to get the integration between A and B, we actually had to do a minor integration to System C. And no one
Mhm.
really saw that. We discovered it in the process, right? But opening or presenting the door that if we don't, we may not have the budget, or we may just find too many things that we'll have to park and get back to and justify it another time. So just starting that conversation really early at least mitigates clients trying to stuff more things into the project that clearly weren't budgeted or anticipated by everyone, and they're trying to sort of pressure you into doing it. And in the relationship, you'll do so much, but you don't want to lose money on a job because of something that wasn't your fault.
Right.
So, there's a line there, but having that bucket and having it there at the very beginning of discussing the project, that when we find a certain threshold of stuff, we should be accumulating it, taking advantage when it comes up, and parking it for, maybe it's version 2 and no more with an integration. We missed a
Right.
few things, everyone missed them. We managed to plug a few holes, but and that even works better, obviously, when you're doing a new implementation of an ERP system, or even a smaller app where there's more configuration to be done, but we can't get to it all, and it's no one's fault. No one, we learn as we go. So that kind of helps, takes some of the pressure off of the last minute scope battle, as in, everyone's pointing fingers at everyone else should have foreseen this.
Right, right. Well, it's so this has been a great discussion, Derek. I mean, you're pointing out. I think if I really kind of think of the summary of it, the discussion, you're pointing out a key challenge in many organizations is this massaging of the scope back and forth.
Mhm.
Especially when it's between two departments in an organization, or two organizations if it's external, and just how challenging and difficult this is, and so I think it's a key thing to consider, you know, what the role of agile is in this, in terms of, setting up sprints that can be helped to manage this, as well as is another aspect of it as well. So, anyways, I thanks for providing this insight into it from your perspective, and I appreciate the discussion with you.
Oh, my pleasure. I'll point out that before we started, thinking about this, we didn't have exclusion lists in our statements of work that we signed with customers. And when we did start putting them in and got better and better at them, the whole relationship and the volatility of the projects went way down. So I
Right.
think it's a worthwhile effort.
Yeah, good. No, it's and that certainly is, when it really comes down to it, communication,
Hmm.
relationships, documentation. So if you can blend those together, the exclusion lists, like you say, are a good aspect of it. So that's the way out of that's the way out of this challenge. That helps you get those things done. So good insights on that. So, but anyways, well, thanks again. It's great always
Thanks, Dave.
talking to you. Okay,
Well, enjoy
take,
it. Take care.
take care.